Welcome to the second sessions on Territory, Urbanism Beyond Technofix. Thank you for coming today, despite the kind of looming situation where we don't know what's going to happen. So this is still a class, so thank you for attending that class that you actually registered to. As I said, it's the second session. We had last week Theo Deutinger, and we are welcoming Iris van der Tuin and Nanna Verhoeff, together with Benjamin Dillenburger for the session today. And I just want to make a note, pay attention to the date of the last event, which has been previously announced as the 11th May, and it's actually on the 4th of May. So please edit that in your calendars. So that was the lecture of last week. This week, as I said, this is the conversation that we'll have, concepts for mobile architecture. The speakers that we welcome today, Iris van der Tuin is professor in theory of cultural inquiry at the Faculty of Humanities at Utrecht University, and she's the author of the book New Materialism, Interviews and Cartographies, discussing new materialism as an interdisciplinary, theoretical and politically committed field of inquiry, emerging from the front lines of feminism, philosophy, science studies, and cultural theory, cross-fertilized by both human and natural sciences. And together with Nanna Verhoeff, which is an associate professor in the Department of Media and Culture Studies at Utrecht University, who specializes in screen cultures. And this is among her latest publication, a work on urban interfaces, the cartographies of screen-based installations in the city about materiality, mediality, and performativity of urban interfaces. And together, they are setting up the Creative Humanities Academy, an infrastructure for the collaborations of academics and professionals that provides consultancy on humanities theories, methodologies, and pedagogies. So, as you see, we are kind of trespassing the limits of the discipline, and we are very interested in having conversations that are, let's say, maybe outside of the classical realm of what the school actually discusses. And to enrich this conversation, after the talk by Iris and Nanna, we will have Benjamin Dillenburger, which is an assistant professor for digital building technologies here at the Institute of Technology and Architecture, whose research focuses on the development of building technologies based on the close interplay of computational design methods, digital fabrication, and new materials. So with no further delay, I would like to, so sorry, this was the image that was illustrating Benjamin's work. And with no further delay, I will ask Iris and Nanna to start their presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here and for inviting us. It's an honor to be here, and we're very much looking forward to the conversation that we hope we can have after our presentation and Benjamin's presentation. A dialogue, I hope, between the various disciplines that we represent in this room today. So, in this presentation, let me see if you're... How does it work? We fixed it, and it's actually connecting to what I was going to say. So, in our presentation, we want to activate two meanings of the verb to fix. One referring to offering solutions to problems, and the other to fixating, in the sense of adjusting, making rigid or immobile. And with the bracket mobile architecture in our title, we bring together our two perspectives and voices as philosopher and media theorist on thinking architecture in and for mobility, and on concepts as having a creative force. So let's start and see if this indeed works. It does. Dus moet ik
Okay. Yes, part 1, situating mobile architecture. Suzanne K. Langer is an American philosopher. She was born in 1895 and she died in 1985. Langer spent her youth in Manhattan, born in a German immigrant family, surrounded by other such families. German was her first language. In 1916, she moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, in order to study at Radcliffe College, the college for women that was connected to Harvard University. Harvard at the time did not accept any female students, but the women studying at Radcliffe could benefit from Harvard's infrastructure and faculty members. Langer received both her undergraduate and graduate degrees from Radcliffe, where she was studying with, for example, the British mathematician turned philosopher Alfred North Whitehead. Her primary field was logic. Later in life, she published a lot on the philosophy of art, and she wrote a trilogy titled Mind, which was a tour de force trying to prove that feeling was the common ground of all human production, aesthetic, scientific, philosophical. It took Langer several decades to finish the trilogy. As she eventually turned blind, the books were finished with the help of several assistants. I met Langer in a footnote of a student paper. Whereas the student mentioned Langer in passing, I Googled her immediately, as I did not know her, and I was instantly amazed by her wide-ranging interests and her seeming disrespect for the philosophical canon. In philosophy, thinkers are often classified according to schools of thought, and schools of thought are often seen as mutually exclusive. Think of a logic-based tradition of analytic philosophy, and a life and literature-based tradition of continental philosophy. And of course, these are stereotypes. Langer borrowed from both traditions, as not only was Whitehead her PhD supervisor, but also did she befriend the German philosopher Ernst Cassirer in the early 1940s. Whitehead started off as a logician and ended up as a philosopher of process, of life. Cassirer started off as a philosopher of life with an interest in Kulturwissenschaften, but was often framed in a quite analytical key. Not long ago, I spent some time in the Houghton Library in Cambridge in order to study Suzanne Langer's card index system, a system on and with she worked for several decades. The system contains cards indexing all that she has read and cards cross-referencing how readings interlink. Langer read philosophy, biology, anthropology, art history, the neuroscience, and so on and so on. The system has all kinds of other characteristics that situate it as part of a changing world. Not only do we encounter changing gender, sexual, and race relations of power, but also do we see the growing role and place of ICTs in science and society. I even found a dried lavender branch indicating that Langer's entire world folds into and out of the card index system. Out of the thousands of cards that I have looked at, Nanna and I chose this one for our presentation, and I will read it to you. Note, mobile architecture. The architecture of small boats is dictated by the seascape on which the boat is set. The Indian canoe slides like a fish. The Norse boat is obviously suggested by the swimming bird. The trireme is a human stronghold defying the waters. The various sloops and junks, plus other boats concentrating on the sail, are drifters like leaves. But whatever the motive, the boat or ship is the place of man on the waters. Trains, cars, carriages for travel are all mobile housings. Their expression is of temporary adjustment and especially safety. A railroad car should not look like a parlor, but invite the packing away of luggage, rather than its opening out, as hotels should, and the forward orientation of the traveler. Given the handwriting, Langer seems to have written this card halfway through her philosophical career. But it is not for Langer immanent reasons that we chose this card. What do we read on it? Langer discusses mobile architecture, a term that does not feature prominently in her oeuvre, so we cannot rely on a footnote and understand the card easily or reduce it to some clear-cut meaning. Architecture, for Langer, is an art form that gives to the sense of movement, just like painting gives to the sense of sight, sculpture to the sense of touch, and music to the sense of hearing. The curious formulation of giving to the sense of is intentional. Langer wants to stay away from an idea of art forms resembling movement, sight, touch, hearing, etc. Art speaks to these senses, as it were, and activates them. Being one of the plastic arts, architecture addresses virtual space. Pictures and painting address space through scene, sculpture via kinetic volume, and architecture by expressing an ethnic domain. Ethnic here is not supposed to mean a place of in and exclusion of a people. Langer writes, architecture has its own center and periphery, not dividing one place from all others, but limiting from within whatever there is to be. And she wrote this in her book Feeling and Form from 1953. Mobile architecture, we can read in Langer, also implies a mobility in thinking architecture and is not simply limited to moving objects. We find on this card that Langer makes a distinction between motive and expression, whereby she prefers expression to motive. With motive, we multiply resemblances. Boats slide like fish, swim like birds, float like leaves. And with the logic of resemblance, we narrow down our possible frames of analysis. A resemblance is individual. It is my generalized interpretation that X resembles Y. And it is cultural. It is an over-coded interpretation that X resembles Y. Resemblances work with the register of sight. Look, a boat that slides like a fish. Such a logic fixates how we can think about art forms, here architecture, and reduces how we may interpret individual works of art and our engagements with them. On this register, we do not discuss what the work itself may do and what it may intervene in. Expression, however, allows for the study of precisely this performativity. All possible boats or ships are the place of people on waters, and all possible carriages are the place of people on roads. Both kinds of places express temporary adjustment and especially safety, and as such they are meant to close in instead of open out. Unfixing the way in which we think about art forms, we are enabled to transcend the game of representation and its corollary truth-falsity discussions. We are enabled to be creative with artistic, design, and technological production. In the words of Langer's friend Cassirer, witness the problem of flight, which could only finally be solved once technological thinking freed itself from the model of bird flight and abandoned the principle of the moving wing. So all possible planes are the place of people in the air. Langer's move from resemblance to expression can be understood as a move from representation to conceptualization. The representational register allows us to only repeat what we think we know about boats and planes and fish and birds and leaves. We are invited to project these fixating and fixative knowledges onto one another and naturalize their apparent connection. The conceptual register, however, focuses on the intervention of that what is, in the same movement, identified. Flight for human travel came into being and could finally be experimented with once the restriction of the fixed model of bird flight was left behind. This is precisely the performativity of the concept.
Part 2, Creative Humanities. Let's continue with the creative force of concepts. As Iris has shown, concepts exist in a dynamic relationality with objects. Concepts do not represent individual objects because the objects come into being as a specific set with their conceptualization. The mobile architecture that Susanne Langer and Ernst Cassirer refer to was situated differently compared to the mobile architectures I've been interested in as a media theorist. Importantly, however, notions of fixing and unfixing, that is, of thinking architecture in and for mobility, were quite similar. From our collaboration in the following, we want to sketch a conceptual and what we call a creative humanities approach for the question of un-techno-fixing architecture. The creative humanities is the meeting point of philosophy and theory of the humanities on the one hand, and on the other, design disciplines and creative practices in the broadest sense. Today, this meeting is embodied by us as humanities scholars and by you as architecture students. And from this perspective, we want to sketch some specific critical concepts for the creative humanities that we see as maybe relevant for taking up the question central to this series of talks about architecture beyond technofix. By succinctly introducing these specific concepts, but perhaps more importantly, also sketching the performative potential of concepts in the broadest sense, we hope to start a conversation with you about not only how these concepts can be relevant to mobile architecture or to thinking mobile architectures, or the general question of thinking beyond technofix, but also about how concepts play a role on both ends of our disciplinary spectrum: philosophy, media theory, and architecture. As simultaneously discursive and material, that is, as agentially cutting out objects, concepts are unique material with which research is being done. This research is intrinsically dynamic, as concepts are never merely applied onto objects. Rather, research with concepts is done in such a way that not only do we learn something about an object, but also and simultaneously do we sharpen our theoretical toolbox. Critical concepts for the creative humanities, and here the meeting of philosophy, theory, and architecture, are always performative and methodological. As such, they are productive and experimental doings, enmeshed in practice, rather than fixed retrospective labels for things that seemingly exist before and outside of research, artistic design, or curatorial processes. They guide the user to where and when one starts or has started her research, and to the encounter with and in which both researcher and researched come into being. The concepts are inherently experimental, and they open up to yet unknown territories of thought. The creative in creative humanities can be recognized in a literally productive connection between making practice and thinking practice. Making as and through thinking, and thinking as and through making. Creativity is hence a fundamentally methodological quality. The methodologicity involved is emphatically experimental and comfortable with knowledge production in uncertainty, multiplicity, and friction. Thinking with, through, and beyond concepts, creative humanities projects are creative in designing and developing their own methods and approaches, as they seek to navigate and explore the productive connections and reciprocal relationships between the creative practices they engage with and to develop conceptual analytical approaches for what these practices also work with, through or beyond. Through their engagement with contemporary artistic, cultural, and societal issues, as themselves fully immersed in 21st century media and the algorithmic condition, the experimental, scholarly, and creative projects develop conceptual foci whilst also at the same time designing for debate. The concept-driven design thinking in the creative humanities is already fundamentally and programmatically a critical creative practice. This implies first that a creative humanities practice can be recognized as scholarship as it has already been conducted in the past, following a rereading or rewriting. The conceptual practice can, after the fact, in real time, and or speculatively be inserted into humanities scholarship. Second, connections with creative making practices are recognized and explored, but not by way of constructing a paradigmatic transfer from making to researching. Creative humanities scholarship establishes itself inherently and critically as a processual, concept-generating endeavor. In the coming months, Iris and I will be working on the book project Critical Concepts for the Creative Humanities, a glossary or dictionary of sorts that will be published by Rowman and Littlefield, and it comprises a collection of concepts that are provisionally defined, positioned, and demonstrated and referenced in each lemma of the collection. These are new or revisited concepts that are fruitful for and come out of current philosophical and creative practice. The concepts collected in our glossary range from accident to zetesis, include kinning and unkinning, and we also revisit concepts like assemblage, diffraction, and dispositif. The glossary entails the canonization of the work of a younger generation of scholars, a generation that witnessed both the arrival of the creative humanities and constituted its bibliography and praxis. The book establishes the creative humanities with the research-driven output of creative practitioners, designers, cultural curators, and policymakers, work that establishes an emergent canon of avant-garde thinking and the new reading list of scholarship for the next generation of cultural participants or the makers, performance, and audiences of our contemporary arts and culture. At the same time, we aim to provide the contours for the canonization of the new generation of scholars, a generation that we are already part of.
So, part 3, concepts. To introduce the format, let us start with the very last concept in the book that paradoxically provides, perhaps, a starting point for productive meetings of thought, such as today. Zetesis, zetetic. Zetesis means search, examination, or inquiry in ancient Greek, and has an adjective in English, zetetic, meaning proceeding by inquiry. In Socratic and Platonic philosophy, this form of inquiry departs from an inquisitive and critical attitude and from one's own experience of oneself. Often understood as a skeptic attitude of fundamental doubt, in more recent rereading, zetesis has also gotten a more optimistic interpretation of a permanent or iterative questioning. This philosophical etymology of zetesis harbors a congruity between theory and art, that is, the respective roles of curiosity, experimentation, and risk involved in various forms of philosophical and creative inquiry. Therefore, as an analytical concept, zetesis activates a perspective on these traits that are shared by artistic as well as scholarly practices and raises questions about how these practices shape and take shape in specific projects. The concept emphasizes, firstly, a fundamental subjectivity and self-reflexivity involved in both modes of inquiry. Secondly, it refers to this subjectivity as a preliminary starting point for creative research. Thirdly, it raises questions about the open and processual nature of the subsequent research and/or creation as it unfolds with experimentation and hence risky practice. The critical potential of the concept lies in how it raises analytical and evaluative questions about the openness of scholarly and/or creative projects and their transparency about the multiplicity and mobility of their lines, movements, and segues of question and thought, including the role of risk in the process of their emergence, directions, and redirections. Moreover, the synthesis of any kind of research points at its originary starting point, for example, curiosity, or that what produces inquiry, and how this becomes a starting point for debate, invention, and a productive invocation of the imaginary. Such a starting point can indeed be recognized as inspiration for Synthesis, the International Journal for Fine Art, Philosophy, and the Wild Sciences, with its motto of Research by Curiosity. The journal, with executive editor Johnny Golding, professor of philosophy and fine art at the Royal College of Art London, is hosted by the Centre for Fine Art Research and the Research Centre for Creative Making at the Faculty of Arts, Design and Media of Birmingham University. It explores theoretical, philosophical, creative, and political intersections in fine art and scholarship. The concept as name here puts on the agenda the urgency for adopting an intra- and transdisciplinary perspective that is fueled by curiosity and a fascination for the unknown. The second concept that we want to highlight today addresses the problem of fixation. Classifixation. A logic of classifying objects and classifying living or dead organisms underlies the sciences on the one hand, and on the other, institutionalized and activist forms of social relating. The life sciences, for example, divide up the living organisms they study according to a taxonomy. Another example pertains to the social sciences that study kinship structures, anthropology, or other forms of identification and social organization. The humanities classify artifacts of human making according to their form, theater, painting, etc., and individual artworks according to their style or movement, Impressionism, Dadaism, etc. Similarly, institutions and the social movements reacting to them use classification according to categories such as gender, sexuality, and race ethnicity in order to gather the people they wish to represent or to specify the causes they work for. Classification becomes classifixation once the division of people, other organisms, and things in the classes that they seem to belong to, as if by nature, is naturalized, thus erasing diversity and mutability. Contemporary research and creative art practices respond critically and creatively to classifixations on the basis of the recognition that the idiosyncrasies and transformations of individual persons, organisms, and things cannot be captured and are fixated by most classifications. This is because classifications are based on generalizations and have certain other characteristics. Linnaean biological taxonomies are hierarchically structured. There is man and there are lower animals. Classifications of movements in thought are often structured by a sequential negation, whereby Y is said to be more effective, or simply better scholarship, then X, and Z, then Y. Hierarchical structures and sequential negations make the narratives they create progressive. However, progress narrative, just like generalization, does not sit comfortably with idiosyncrasy and non-teleological transformation. Contemporary scientific research, informed by nonlinear biology and quantum mechanics, but also the humanities after post-structuralism with their canon and genre-critical approaches, have acknowledged the reductionism of classification. It is also in the realm of art practices that alternative categorical logics are explicitly experimented with. Dutch photographer Arie Versluys and Dutch stylist Ellie Uitenbroek first published their project, Exactitudes, in book form in 2002. Since 1994, they have approached individual members of perceived subcultures encountered on the streets of Rotterdam in order to photograph them in a studio setting, wearing exactly what they wore upon first meeting them. Their project alludes to a scientific vision working towards classification of humans and is brought together with an interest in the sociological study of generalized groups and types, and with the humanistic study of codes, here dress codes, and idiosyncratic exceptions to the norm. With their project, Versluys and Uitenbroek demonstrate that classifications never quite work and are, their stifling structures notwithstanding, self-deconstructing arrangements.
Our third concept, the last, we promise, perhaps suggests a way out of thinking in fixations. Cartography and performative cartography. Cartography is the practice of creating representations of spatial territories, whether geographical or synthetic, that is digital, architectural, or in other ways created, or theoretical. While cartography is also often used to designate the results of this practice, the cartographies created, the distinction between the process and its result is significant. Creating cartographies is never neutral. It inherently infuses its territories with perspectives, logics, and principles of in and exclusion. Think, for example, of an author or a maker who has fallen off the canon of hierarchically structured anthologies and curricula, or alternatively, of horizontal and open cartographies of thought and practice across scholarship and art. Cartography as a practice is always already a cultural, discursive, and theoretical endeavor as it constructs spatio-temporal relationality and possible future navigation. The navigation on my screen went wrong. Sorry. That's so ironic. Cartography as a practice is always already a cultural, discursive, and theoretical endeavor as it constructs spatio-temporal relationality and possible future navigation through the territories constructed and mapped. When conflating the practice of cartography and its results in cartographies, this process of construction and its implications may become obfuscated. In response to digital, interactive, locative technologies, mobile media, and algorithmic media, the concept of performative cartography emphasizes a shift from object to action. It postulates the need to understand cartography as an activity, as a form of navigation that emerges in mobility, change, and difference, rather than resulting from fixation and delineation, as in traditional representational mapmaking. Understanding cartography as a dual practice, whereby the immanent doing of cartography is a productive integration of space, time, and thought, immediately points at performativity rather than representation. Representational maps are informed by modern epistemologies that not only allow for progressive knowledge production and work according to a Cartesian dualistic logic. Following this logic, a certain territory or phenomenon can be mapped, resulting in a map. Pre-representational or performative maps, on the other hand, foreground process, mutability, flux, simulation, remediation, notions of becoming and mobility. That is, the processes before representation in which representations come into being. Performative cartography foregrounds the processual, procedural, and deictic experience of this navigation as more fluid than fixed spatiotemporal positioning. Performative cartography emerges in movement as a particular form of creative navigation with its maps and its views evolving and emerging along the way. This coupling of time and space after the performative turn encourages a qualitative shift away from modern dualism so that we come to understand the map as a spatial and temporal event. Performative cartography, then, is a cartographizing of multidirectionality, which embodies change, difference, and to some degree, unpredictability and bisque. That was it for now. We are interested, of course, in hearing Benjamin's, but also your thoughts later on. That was a bit sudden. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. I think it's always so interesting to see the different formats that each discipline has to kind of convey its ideas, because usually we're kind of bombarded with images as in our sides of the spectrum, and I find it's, yeah, but it's also kind of forcing you to really kind of listen and like follow the text. I find it actually quite interesting to let's say contrast it with our usual modus operandi of lecturing. There is of course one particular aspect of what you were talking about that I thought was actually resonating with what the lecture series is actually doing, and also perhaps what the chair is trying to do, and then I would also ask Benjamin to follow up on that. But it's the notion of a risky practice, which I, of course, immediately kind of started to reflect on my own practice, but also on Milica's work and perhaps on Benjamin's work. And I was wondering if this would be something that we could try to discuss, as in what is a risky practice in our understanding, perhaps, and what does that mean in terms of criticality? Because you were also kind of positioning the idea that a risky practice is always related to criticality, of course, and how would we basically follow that line somehow?
I mean, perhaps I could add a couple of lines on that. So it's interesting. I really loved the glossary, no? And I could now we could spend hours looking at the glossary and discussing every single concept because it's fantastic. So I just thought, really, just 3 concepts. Let's go on. It's fantastic. This is interesting. And you mentioned that you are also recuperating certain terms, or you are revisiting. I've seen deterritorialization, reterritorialization. So we've seen some Derrida and Foucault and so on. And so I think quite some terms that have played a role perhaps in the last 30, 40 years in the field of architecture are already represented. And of course, I agree fully that concepts are our tools, essentially, right? With which we, so even kind of conventional concepts, we need to kind of constantly discuss them and calibrate our understanding of these concepts in order to make sure they are performative, right? So, for instance, we do this game in my lecture series with students. We call it the concept game, and it's about. I knew you would love it. I have to show it to you. It's sensational. So, it is. So here it's like it works like this. So students are sitting in a lecture room, and we enter. And the lecture begins by saying, okay, we have two concepts today for you. And I give you an example from the last lecture series. One is biophilia and the other one is ecology. And each student gets a piece of paper, which is A4 size. And the concept is written at the top, and at the bottom is the date, and they could sign their name or could sign whatever name they want, and then they should represent their understanding of that concept in a piece of paper, and they have 6 minutes for that. It's a very arbitrary time limit, and they get a A4 pen, and then after that, all the students bring their sheets and they pin them on the wall, and then we can look at that as a kind of mini exhibition. Everything is finished in, let's say, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, but then the lecture is also about these concepts, to say so, or it goes in the direction of that. So in a way, it is about the kind of calibrating. So my question is, it goes where I link to Charlotte, is the notion of what is the risk here, or I would say, what is the convention here that we are trying to break or to move away from, right? Or why is this kind of glossary, why do you find it critical now in this point in time? You know, what kind of, are you trying to address a certain kind of disciplinary condition that you have in creative humanities, or are you trying to address a certain wider cultural condition or political condition, or where do these concepts come in, let's say?
Okay. Yeah. What is the risk that we are taking? Where to start, really? I think where we come from is very much a world in which, and I think that is the world that we all share here, that is a world in which information is everywhere. With information being everywhere and being inherently mobile and dynamic, come new ways of thinking about also scholarship and navigating through this informational world we live in. So that is kind of one end of the spectrum, and then the other end of the spectrum is that what scholarship tries to do in between the walls of academia, at least our kind of academic world, is to contain all kinds of theoretical traditions, objects, interpretations, and these two things don't match anymore. So this idea that, you know, that students come to university to kind of get clear answers, that is kind of no longer what is needed in and for the world. It's no longer what students want, and it is also something that we shouldn't try to deliver anymore because of this, what we call algorithmically kind of organized world of information being omnipresent and also constantly changing. So that is kind of, and we're not necessarily, I mean, the risk part for us is, of course, in the academic kind of practice that we think should change with the world in a way. There's also the point about collaboration.
Yeah, I think another way, someone has accused me of being a structuralist in my thinking. That's fine. So I immediately try to unpack like risk. Okay, so one of the things is like the temporaneity of a project like this, or concepts are always temporary. There are temporary suggestions to work with and in connection to the objects, and whether the objects are analytical objects or objects of making that also, of course, imply an analytical stance in the design phase. The both ends of that are temporary. So there is risk, conceptually risk involved. There's risk in the design of the project as really exploring the dialogic space between these different fields. And I don't mean just institutionally different fields, but traditionally very different types of working. Let's put it that way, like making and design and writing, the type of presentations that we give. We can all imagine various ways of looking at that. There's risk there because risk is not necessarily negative. It's unpredictability to a certain extent, I would say. So not oriented towards a fixed outcome is inherently risky, but maybe, and this is inherently potentially critical. And the criticality of it, I think, is that there's an emphasis if we work with concepts, and I'm sure this is what I hear in your game, this is very much an element of it, there's this self-reflexivity happening. It's the students or your own proposal for articulating what a concept is. What does it make you think of? How would you give it a definition, one of those temporary definitions? It's so much a reflection of the researcher, the person who is in, the subject involved in whatever the practice is. So that is also inherently risky, but also inherently potentially critical. Because I would say that is a core of criticality, sort of inhabiting that space of reflexivity in connection to, well, sorry, I'll stop talking now. And you were doing this, so I was hoping you would.
But I mean, maybe along this line, but on a bigger picture, I'm sure that most of the audiences are architects. Mm-hmm. You were talking about creative humanities, and could you elaborate a bit more on the future role, or maybe the changing role of creative humanities in society? For example, in difference to other parts of humanities, and where would you see, because I think a lot of aspects you are addressing, the creativity, the working with the cartographies, so this is maybe something that is just unique in the creative humanities, or would you see this at risk or in danger also in future?
What was the last thing you said?
I mean, one thing is to basically how you would now see the role of this specific creative humanities, the role of, let's say, the designer in society, as maybe a very unique mode of practice. And the other thing is this also at risk currently? Are we facing developments that would maybe question this role?
Yeah. Well, you suggested something about...
Are you talking about the threat of, let's say, artificial intelligence or
For example, or maybe the threat of that the creativity is not anymore needed or considered as a value because people would not like to take risks, or, but maybe,
yeah. Well, I mean, there are so many answers to this question, I think. I mean, how we approach creative humanities is also very much, as I tried to say earlier, connected to like humanists, humanities scholars. We are very much, how do you say that, stimulated because of funding structures, for example, to go outside of our kind of attic room, you know, in which we have traditionally written our books. And that is, so we are very much invited to kind of like think about how does humanities scholarship, and then you have to think about like art history, literary studies, you know, all of these, you know, philology, all of the more classical kind of humanities approaches. How can we make these approaches kind of productive in society? And what we are trying to do with this project is kind of flip the script a little bit and think about, okay, so we don't want to continue this age-old project of, you know, the scholar kind of sending stuff to what is outside scholarship, because that inside-outside kind of relation doesn't quite exist anymore. So if the university and funding structures, but also the algorithmic condition that we live in asks us to collaborate, let's see where we are already collaborating and what is actually happening on those intersections and in those projects. And we actually think that there is a very productive borrowing is happening, you know, on both ends of what we call the creative humanities. So humanists on the one hand, so to speak, and, you know, artists, curators, you know, in this context, architects, designers, we are very much into borrowing from each other's kind of practices. You see very much that, for example, lots of art institutions or temporary kind of curatorial collectives or whatever, they are also into creating all kinds of concepts and glossaries. And these are popping up because we need them in order to understand what the world is, how this world is kind of like developing itself. The Anthropocene, I think, this concept was picked up in the art world before it was picked up by humanists. But now we are also asked to contribute our thoughts. So I think that is, yeah, that's kind of the script that we want to flip. So we're not going to find money or find collaborating partners. We already have these partners. And what is happening when we have conversations like this? Maybe you also wanted to say something.
Yeah, I'm sure it's different in the professional field of architecture. When we use creativity as a term, it's almost as if you're on purpose almost using a term that has long been something that as a humanist scholar you want to avoid. You don't want to be considered as, yeah, there's a bunch of people thinking about artsy-fartsy stuff, you know? And at the same time, so we're just looking at the idea of creativity as literally making. It's nothing artsy-fartsy necessarily about that. But I'm sure that creativity as a label for certain aspects of architectural, the trade of architecture, the profession of architecture, encounters maybe similar or also resistance to that notion, or maybe you have to also feel that there are risks and pressures to certain, I mean the whole, as we understood the framing of this lecture series, it's also very much like how can we respond and unfix, right, and find the nexus of something that maybe we can now, for the moment, call creativity, or I don't know what you want to call it, but so yes, the word creativity immediately signals danger, I guess. Yeah.
I mean,
can I add just a quick something to this? I think humanities scholarship, but also like scholarship, like traditionally, but also scholarship, humanities scholarship that was critical, always made these kind of distancing kind of movements. So, you know, there is you talk about art, you talk about social movements, you talk about something. And whereas this movement, you know, to critically discuss something that is happening in this world, of course we are doing that. But we are also what we are at the same time trying to do is not to make this distancing movement and to actually say the processes that we are, you know, critical about are also the processes that we, in a way, that we participate in, that we benefit from, and that have to be changed maybe from within. So this whole idea of, you know, that there is neutrality, there is criticality, and there is creativity. I mean, this triad, I think we are trying to rethink. So neutrality doesn't exist, has never existed. Criticality is still needed. Well, at least maybe you view that differently, but for us, neutrality has never existed. So simply the fact that you're coming from a particular discipline is already a situated, non-neutral position. I mean, I'm not saying something radical when I'm saying that neutrality doesn't exist. I think criticality, we still practice, but we don't practice it from without. And creativity means we are part of the processes that we are researching.
Right. I would be really happy to continue along the same lines, but perhaps try to come a step closer to the notion of technology and technofix, right? And the way to do that, I would ask if we could concentrate on this phrase that you have used several times, algorithmic condition, no? So how exactly do you understand this algorithmic condition? What are ramifications for, let's say, daily life, for creativity, for, you know, humanities, for let's say, various creative practices under, or let's say, various practices that are are associated with creativity, and also that are associated with humanism. I think these are very interesting links, because you know, for instance, I mean, there are sort of latent avenues to explore here, many different ones. You know, so for instance, what's the relationship between quantitative and qualitative information, right? I mean, this, I'm sure, is very much related to the notion of algorithmic condition, or what is the kind of a perhaps we could say what are the kind of a power geometries in the academic field among the different disciplines that use different tools, right? Is algorithmic condition actually foregrounding certain kinds of science, to say so, over other kinds of science? For instance, you know, are creative humanities, is philosophy, are language studies, or even architecture, are they perhaps disadvantaged under the algorithmic condition in relation to, for instance, you know, mechanical engineering, computer science? I'm not implying anything here. I'm just wondering, right? What is happening, right? So in a way, you're dealing with power relationships, right? Or unmasking those different relationships. So why are we using term creative humanities? I'm just kind of, why not saying innovation in humanities? You know? That's what I mean, right? So that's interesting, right? So where does, you know, why is one concept, you know, so certain concepts are, you know, we are posing, you're putting forward certain tools, certain conceptual tools that are perhaps, you know, critical or performative, as you said, vis-a-vis another set of values, or you know, how does that work? So I just had a sense that we could try to start unpacking all this by somehow entering through this notion of algorithmic condition.
Wow. Okay. Well, the notion of algorithmic condition, that comes from a project I did together with 4 scholars, one from Vienna, one from London, one from Dublin, and myself. And you can Google this project, that is, the full name is Ethics of Coding, Report for the Algorithmic Condition. And we are scholars not only from different countries, but also from different disciplines. So I was there as a philosopher, there's a media arts person in the project, an educational scientist, and an architectural theorist who used to work here, Vera Buhlmann, her name is. And we basically made that move that I talked about earlier, this idea that, okay, there is lots of funding out there that wants us to do, and our universities want us to do something with that funding. Let's try to develop a project that talks about the world we currently live in. And why algorithmic condition? Well, in 1979, Jean-François Lyotard, who's a French philosopher, wrote The Postmodern Condition, and that was called, the subtitle was A Report on Knowledge. So here you have The Postmodern Condition, A Report on Knowledge from 1979, and Ethics of Coding, A Report on the Algorithmic Condition. And that was published in 2018. And whereas Lyotard talks about the role of ICTs, we talk about algorithms, big data, machine learning, and how that actually changes our world, the world in which we work at universities and do scholarship. So whereas, for example, Lyotard was worried also very much about the legitimacy of knowledge, you know, copying, copyright, you know, all of these issues that are more surrounded with ICTs, we were talking about also all kinds of like users agreements, but also serendipity and all kinds of processes that are more connected to machine learning, for example. So a different, what we were also talking about, and that is something that you probably know much more about than me in terms of its very technicalities. We were trying to say that the world in which we produce knowledge has changed. So that is where the phrase algorithmic condition kind of comes from. And with that, we actually wanted to kind of acknowledge the fact that also in humanities scholarship, now quantitative data, if you want it or not, if you like it or not, is actually active and is being used and guides us in a way. And as well as in the field of arts, of course. Yeah, so maybe that is a first answer to what you were asking about.
Maybe related to this, you mentioned often that there's actually an abundance of knowledge available now, maybe due to digital technologies. And you mentioned the interdisciplinarity, something that is also probably new to our society now, or is also a very productive environment. How would you, in this context, imagine then a future academia or a future academic process, under the condition that there's an abundance of knowledge available and that people from different disciplines, maybe with totally different expertise, would work together? What would this mean for the future structure of an academia or an academic life?
These are such fundamental questions that I like the question. I think I approach this very much from the perspective of Michel Serres in his book Thumbelina, so Petite Poussette in French, and this is a very, very small little booklet that is about like young people growing up in this world of abundant information and access to databases through your thumb in a way. And Michel Serres, I mean, he's enthusiastic about this. He died a few years ago, but the book ends actually with him like talking about like when I'm in the metro in Paris and I see all of these like young people active on their phones, I'm super jealous and I need those, I want those skills. But what he opens his book with is almost an empty page that has a question, only one question, that is the first page of his book, and it says, we keep on teaching our students, but we have no idea anymore who they are. So he asks all kinds of questions about like, what does using mobile phones to our brains, what does the fact that students are in the classroom with their laptops, what does that change with to like attention? Actually, when Wikipedia is better than what they find in the library, like what do we have to teach these kids? And there, I think, concepts come in again, and also interdisciplinarity, because like a piece of information is nothing. You actually have you need to teach people, and we also have to retrain ourselves. We need to teach students and ourselves the skills to actually evaluate and study like pieces and navigate, and that is very much Nanna's field, this informational kind of world in which we live. So, like to get looking at the very, and studying the very nature of information and insights, that is, I think, developing a common language in order to talk about those evaluations, that is the very nature of interdisciplinary work. And that is also where new conceptual frameworks, new languages come into being or are produced very, very, very explicitly.
Please go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add two key words that figure in my work at the moment, but I actually see as also keywords for thinking this situation is indeed navigation and navigational skills and interface. I'm thinking of the understanding of the logic of interface, not just of interfaces as objects or instantiations, but the logic of that communicative concept. I can imagine a university or rethinking disciplinary boundaries and collaboration in terms of various forms of interfacing, very different principles of interfacing also. That does not have to be one model, but yeah, so just wanted to add that word.
Actually, I was just, as soon as you asked your question about, let's say, where do you asked the question to Iris and to Nanna, where does this new interdisciplinarity come in, right? In work with the students, and I'm really dying to know how you would answer this question, or because you are also a pedagogue, and you work with students, and you work with a kind of incredibly, I would say creative, let's say take on what the let's say the 3D printing allows and other technologies. So this is. In a way, your work looks like a very unique. It betrays a kind of a very unique position. It looks to me, it looks like that. So I'm curious. What does that in fact link to some new form of pedagogies, or are there concepts that perhaps you keep close and you are, to say, so proud of, or that are central in your work? So let's say. I'm really curious about that.
Yeah, maybe I can answer to that, because it's really highly related to our work, but I'm also like currently most of the time a researcher at ETH, but in a very interdisciplinary research context. One could question if it's probably not interdisciplinary enough, but we are working in the National Competence Center of Research in Digital Fabrication with roboticists, computer scientists, structural engineers, architects all together, and it is a big opportunity for example, knowledge production or research, also innovation, but it is a big challenge to work interdisciplinary because, as you said, you have to develop the interfaces, you have to develop how to understand each other, how to actually be able to talk about concepts and not talk without understanding each other. And so that's really a major part of these collaborative projects or research projects that we are doing, that over 50% of the work is about learning to understand each other. And then I do think that innovation is really can be found very much in combining things together. Huh? Like you mentioned the example of the flying, that one has to rethink the concept of the wing, but one also has to invent the flying, one had to also bring several concepts together in order to make this step, to be able to fly. And that's from the research part, I think, where I can very much connect to, but also in the teaching, we teach also how to code, coding literacy, but we more and more are confronted, and we have to ask us this as teacher all the time, is it, what kind of knowledge should we transfer in the class? Because we would see, I would see the future here in a very project-driven teaching, which is not about the pure knowledge transfer, but about really dealing with concepts, developing concepts, and bringing, and to actually use the academic context for projects, conceptual work, while the knowledge, pure knowledge acquisition or so could also happen now in totally different formats. Huh? And of course, in my own work as an architect and so, I try always, it's not that we just drive technology without thinking about concepts. So I think maybe the strength could be here that we try to always bound or root these projects in another conceptual domain. And I think that could also be fruitful and maybe makes them different than other works as well.
Just to go on with that and to kind of maybe loop back with this algorithmic condition, because you especially, I mean, there is a reason why you're here. It's not just because we are happy to have you, but there is a kind of overlap with this discussion on the production of knowledge as well as the kind of reassessment of what we teach. I think it's very salient to say that the student body is different and changes, and then you really need to react to that. And the work that you produce, I mean, there was this small image of your work, and some of it even takes the name of Baroque, right? There is a work that you exhibited, grotesque, exactly. So, which is fringing, obviously, on creativity, but at the same time has a foot on this kind of very, let's say, neutral is not the word I'm looking for, but more dry, let's say, maybe coding field, and also the field of technology and architecture, which is somehow distanciated from politics, if I may. So, and even though your work is not kind of claiming politics, but at least there is a certain stance on aesthetics that is non-neutral per se. I mean, I don't think that the work that is produced by your research is neutral in any way. So I'm just kind of interested in a kind of a conversation where this, in a way, I want to force you to tell us a little bit more about that, let's say, approach of yours, which is, in a way, also going that way.
The kind of aesthetic aspect of it. Yeah.
But so I mean, I think that people, you were referring to the works that some of them are, we have two works that are called digital grotesque, and these are projects where we, and this was mentioned in your talk as well, and very nicely articulated about the categories and how we can maybe see categories as something that limits us as a designer, for example, if we permanently think inside the categories, if we don't think outside of the box. And in these projects we try to specifically work with a kind of fluid categorization, grotesque, that would allow very different modes of interpretation of forms that would, for example, and one of the intention of these forms is to not be easy to be categorized. Huh? So, and that's actually difficult, but we create this in-between state that would allow people to project their own ideas inside these work. And I think to search for boundaries of categories and rethink existing classifications in architecture can be a very productive instrument in design, and that is one part, one aspect or conceptual aspect of our work. Often I do think that also the digital here helps us, because we can use the digital to create things that are very difficult to grasp with the common vocabulary that we have.
Maybe it's a good moment to open up to the public. If you have questions.
And if not, our
They
guests
have questions
for you.
Wow. I wanted to harvest concepts.
Of course, it's coming.
Well, yeah, I mean, last week we had a nice kind of ping-pong moment with Andreas Ruby, who was asking actually the audience how the conversation that we were having was something that could be interesting for your own understanding of the discipline, or how technology actually obviously has penetrated so many aspects of life, and how you actually yourself react to this, or how you see actually such a conversation as something that could be enriching, or actually if you, even on the opposite, if you don't actually see the interest, or if you're more critical towards this kind of conversation. So I'm just gonna pick a victim who's gonna have to say a kind of, give an opinion. I already know who is my first victim, because it's somebody who spoke last week.
But I'd like to say something smart. Actually, I'd like to maybe ask a question for Benjamin, and it's something very personal. Like, I'm visiting a course this year from Grammatio Kohle, and it's like the whole aspect of like digital fabrication and architecture and everything was something, I have to admit, never really interested me, because I thought it's something which seems to me very alien to the discipline. And I, for a very long time also, I mean, this is really critical, but I thought that, yeah, it's just like adding new shapes and forms and kind of aesthetics to the discipline. And for me, like, I now learned that also from philosophical point, it's also enriching me personally as a designer, and also I think it can really inform the whole discipline once again, and also maybe shake it a little bit, because I think that the discipline of architecture is very slow in taking up new modes of techniques and everything. And it's also where maybe on Milica's question that if like the technology would favor certain disciplines more, that I think that architecture could be one of the victims, maybe now, but I don't know.
So, but the question would be if architects could be the victim of these developments, and you're referring to digital fabrication, and to maybe also computational design, or the computer in the design process, which would be more my expertise as well. Huh? But I do think there's one fear that it could be just something superficial on a purely aesthetic point of view, and I think this is a period that we had already in architecture. So there was a lot of, and I'm not saying that it's something negative, I mean there was a lot of formal experiments already with digital fabrication methods, but the impact it can have in future can be much more fundamental, and can also provide us new concepts of thinking architecture, of the making of architecture, but also the conceptualization of architecture in general. So a digitally fabricated building can also behave totally different than a building that is basically designed with the constraints of an older industrial fabrication in mind. I don't think that architects need to be afraid of becoming the victims, but I think it is good if architects gain enough knowledge or enough insights in these different technologies to be able to play a synthetic a game of synthesis, a combinatorial game of knowing where you need to combine which strategies in order to push your concept, or also to be innovative and creative in the world. And I see there the role of the architect very much of maybe a curator of these different technologies, of someone who clearly defines, based on the conceptual thinking, also which strategies, which technologies should be taken and used.
Are there other questions? Otherwise, I'm going to choose another victim.
You rescued everybody.
Glad to do that. First, a little comment. I just want to say that I'm very enthusiastic about this glossary as well. So engaging today in the world of research and trying to go with another approach of trying to find out to which category I belong, I see there something very rich to work with. And so the first question is very technical, is when or where can I know more about that? And the second question is, whilst that kind of, this glossary and all these concepts illuminated me for that part of the presentation, I didn't quite get the relation to the works of Susan Langer. If you could just recap a bit on that for my understanding.
So your first question was about where can I get a hold on the concepts? Was yes, yes.
It's going to be like that.
Yeah.
You're gesturing that. It's going to be big book.
No, the book is, we're writing this book, Critical Concepts for the Creative Humanities now, and it will come out maybe in a year and a half or something.
So these sections were actually sections that are going to be in the book.
Yeah, so what we presented was, we selected from some parts that were already done. But if you're interested, what we can do is through Charlotte, we can send you links to like several other glossary projects that are out there and that have already been produced either in academia or outside academia. What we do is like we work on this intersection of, you know, creative practice and the humanities. That is, you know, but we collect them. We collect these kind of glossary and dictionary projects that have been produced on both ends in a way, because we do think that there's something missing, otherwise we wouldn't write our own book, but we can definitely like share links.
And we'll set up something so that you can submit a concept that you want to be in the book. We have to organize that. I think that's very important.
So please give us your email address. Anyway, the link to Langer. Yeah, what is the link to Langer? The mobile architecture link and the link to that in which we were trying to say something about this concept object kind of dynamic, and the move from representation, so resemblance, you know, a mobile kind of a piece of mobile architecture functions like a bird, and like leaving behind that kind of representational link and trying to think about architecture mobility differently. I think that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, and also I just want to emphasize that the structure of the talk was also performing the way that we're at the moment working together, collaborating, but also finding these meeting points. And when we were invited to for this talk, the way that we were thinking about architecture, we both were thinking mobile architecture, mobilization, making unfixed, but then we came into the creative humanities concept. So it represents that train of thought also a little bit, if it makes sense. Good question.
More questions? Yes? Sorry.
I'm just wondering if maybe any word could be a concept, and then this word, just take a dictionary, open it, and start up a discussion. And why let's do a book of concepts? I mean, I understand you change the words, you express an opinion about the word, but why don't just take a dictionary and say those are our concepts?
I'm going to ask you to give a succinct definition of what a concept is. I would actually want to, that was a little bit on my agenda, that if we would get there in a conversation with you guys, I was hoping to see or to look at the way that we think what a concept is, maybe very differently. That is, I think, a very interesting question. In principle, just to say about this project, it's going to be an open-ended project. So there's going to be a web companion, online compendium, but where also students and people engaged in teaching and working with students or in other collaborative projects can contribute. So it will be open-ended. So we're counting on you to make the concept game to, I don't know, somehow part of that. So it's going to be an concept ecosystem, ideally. The principle, I would say yes, but a concept is not interesting as a word. It's interesting what the conceptualization of the concept is interesting, and that one is mobile and responsive to whatever you do with it. And in that doing, the concept emerges. So if we take peanut butter, I'm fine with that being a concept, but let's then make, and not on the level of representation, so it's not denoting smoothness or yucky taste or anything. It has to be a concept, so it has to go beyond a metaphor. Yeah. But what is, or a description? Mm-hmm. So, but in principle, you could say that there's no limits, or there's no, the words themselves can be, it can be also, they're concepts, right, that are signs, not words. The slash and the dash, remember? Mm-hmm. The last concepts on our list, we cheated a little bit. We said synthesis was the last one. But we have some additional ones that are actually typographic signs that are conceptualized, that have been conceptualized, like the dash and the slash and the... So it can even be not words that are become concepts.
I think what you're pointing at is that the minute you have formulated or you have conceptualized something, you can point at it. You can say like, oh, that's what you were talking about. But that's not the only part of conceptualization that we are interested in. It's also this whole process of inventing that. If you see what I mean. So you can describe something, you can prescribe something, you know, but you can also conceptualize something, and that is more than just describing. But the minute you have conceptualized, for example, in this case, classification, you do also see it in the world. So you were able to mobilize the concept of classification that we conceptualized and that you heard an hour ago. But for us, there was this process of really like trying to formulate carefully like what that was. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, but...
Yeah, and also there's sometimes words have a double meaning. They are concepts, but they're also objects. The word I use, interface, you can of course think of it as an object, and you can think of something totally different as an interface. So concepts are cool. I think. but also you can sort of certain words like cartography. Yeah, I think it was in that description as well. Cartography can be the product of cartography as a, so it's a verb, it's a product, and it's actually a concept that we can use to recognize the principle of cartography somewhere else. So a concept also makes it possible to transport your thinking, to mobilize your thinking, to unfix.
No, so they function on an empirical register because they point to something in the world, but they also transcend that kind of representational kind of game between the word and the world, because there is world making is part of conceptualization.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I just want, no, I don't want to respond, but I just want to point out something else. So if it's open up a discussion, right? So is the book the best solution for this idea? And wouldn't it be like a digital platform of discussion?
Exactly.
Where you put the concept, I mean, then you're not really doing a book, but you're creating like the archive of a new platform where discussion would come into play, you know? I mean,
No, it's very true. It's just that, would it be also the demands of our profession that we need to publish books? Why we choose to also do a book? And also you need funding for that platform and hosting. So we found a publisher who's actually interested in that, to have a book, open access, digital, blah, 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 but also this ongoing platform. And we're interested actually in continuing, expanding also to think about not just concepts, but also methods, and also creative methods that are not just about making something, but actually about making thinking. So creative methods as a research tool. And we were interested in didactics, so pedagogies, like working formats, game formats, for example, or workshop formats, with which you can do this thinking, and with which you can do this bringing together of different disciplines or working practices. So you're absolutely right that this calls for digital expansion.
okay.
So what do you say to your students doing the concept game, what a concept is?
I probably tell them that these are crucial tools with which we perceive the world,
Right.
you know, and that everything starts there, right? So basically, and that we also need a certain common understanding. So I also point to them that as architects, I point to the kind of problem of interdisciplinarity, so that a lot of concepts are entering our field in which we are not necessarily experts. Mm-hmm. For instance, cartography resides in geography. Let's say ecology is ecology, and so so let's say urbanization. We also behave like we have invented it, but in fact we didn't. It really comes from another field. So in fact our knowledge is very limited where it comes to scholarly definitions, and we even want to go beyond them, right? So in a way, so there is a kind of a problem of first of all, what is to say, so the mainstream understanding, and then what would be the kind of a critical or creative interpretation in terms of our, let's say, desired orientation and so on. So it's about understanding, it's about common language, so kind of learning the basis, but then also hopefully going beyond the basis, right? So this is I'm quite. Yes, we have. I just wanted to ask you, how many concepts do you have?
I don't know. I just know the size.
The list. The list, right? because I'm very encouraged, at least it fits on one slide, so it looks quite doable, right? It's, if that's... Okay. Okay, so please.
Another question, going precisely on that and reflecting on your question. In this glossary, there's a selection. You're, we could say, the editor of your glossary. So, just wondering I think you already mentioned it, but what is your, does it go to a certain agenda, or what's your line of selection?
Okay. Let's assume Iris and I have a different answer to this. There are multiple, so I'll give one answer to it. We took the liberty of choosing the ones that we're interested in. No agenda, but the overarching agenda is that that it wants precisely to point at this moment. That they need to be concepts that are indeed worked with in these different fields, and that have a currency at this moment. But of course, this moment, it's going to be hugely successful, so it's going to continue being a very long project. This moment is now, and so therefore it needs to have an open format. So we're interested in it, so combination of young scholars, neologisms we love, but not exclusively, also the revisits of other older concepts. The classification was a neology in your work, right? And there's several of my neologisms in it as well. And it's also represents a community of scholarship that we are part of. And so the agenda is not to represent that, to have, like, if you look at this list, you'll know the field, but it does represent, I think, a community as well. And what more, it needs cutting down, and we need new concepts. So it's, yeah. Right? Or do we have an agenda?
No, I think the agenda is to make this interface between between creative practice and a particular way of doing the humanities visible. And I think there's the cutting down part is also very much linked to concepts that haven't yet been written about in the other glossaries that are out there. You know?
And the format, now that we're talking, we could talk for hours, I don't want to bore you, but just with the format of the lemmas, we chose to have really short ones that have these 3 sections of sort of a positioning of the concept, a way that we think that it can be made productive as a lens, and where we see it demonstrated in preferably some kind of creative practice or design practice. And this is for us a very open bracket. It can be, but some, yeah. And the references are not like exhaustive, but more like possibly interesting, like new ways of thinking about the concept. Like not teaching like the background, but someone who's picked it up in an interesting way. So we take the liberty, and thankfully we find a publisher who says, great. But we make a criticism. There was a hand somewhere, no? Yeah. Dreams? Yeah. Dreams? Yeah, just.
I want to question about this mentioning of the inside and outside, and it doesn't really exist anymore. So I wonder, are there still like really hard cores to our disciplinaries? And so this notion was also kind of connected for me to this interdisciplinary approach. So are there still cores or hard cores of the disciplines we are working in, and do we need to kind of defend them within this progressive approach of interdisciplinary work?
Perhaps also Benjamin has to answer this question. Okay.
Okay.
This is a very good question. So when I think about interdisciplinarity, I always think about disciplined interdisciplinarity, which means that you start your interdisciplinary endeavor from a disciplinary location. And of course, for example, architecture or philosophy or media theory or media studies, or which doesn't and of course in these different disciplines, they are themselves multiple. So that it's not easy to position yourself within a discipline, because that means you already make choices. And interdisciplinary collaborations lead to new disciplines. Think about one of the disciplines that I was schooled in, gender studies, is what we call a neo-discipline. So it came into being on the intersection of several disciplines, and from that it got institutionalized, and another discipline kind of got invented in a way that is now functioning in all kinds of interdisciplinary collaborations. And the link to our concept work and your question and this interdisciplinarity stuff is that there is always the call to position yourself and the research that you are doing, the projects that you are undertaking, the things you want to make. So in an interdisciplinary context, you know, that indeed, I think part of your question was also like, aren't we pushed very much towards these interdisciplinary collaborations? Is that very okay, whatever? I mean, interdisciplinary collaborations are only interesting when there's people that clearly position themselves and that can dare to defend their concepts and dare to give them up and to create new concepts. Maybe that is an answer to your question, or at least it's a response.
I mean, I can only add to this, but thinking in the interdisciplinary work we do with other experts, and I think as architects we are forced to work interdisciplinary in practice as well, but looking at the specific expertise of architects and the way our curriculum is set up, the expertise of an architect is already interdisciplinary. So often in these teams, when we are working together with others, then the role of the architect is often to maybe steer, to control this process, because he's able to, with some expert knowledge in different fields, to synthesize these processes and bring them together. And that's, I think, one specific aspect of the discipline of architecture.
And do you think that this ability to synthesize, do you think the synthesis is somehow aspect of creativity? I think this is an interesting, perhaps, question, because it lets it to leave a message to the students, right? I think, is there a way that in the future of this education we can train the kind of ability of better interdisciplinary conversation, the ability of architects to engage with different disciplines? Is there space? I would ask both Benjamin and I would ask you from a kind of a more, let's say, a general perspective, right? So how do we bring interdisciplinarity into the actual training? You know, into the schooling, right? How do we discuss this sort of inside-outside questions? Because we, I think for a lot of us, perhaps who are the products of a, let's say, 20th century educational system, I mean, discipline is something which is very strong, right? And then whose boundaries are very strong, and interdisciplinarity is something that the person encounters over the course of professional life as a kind of a necessity, and your, let's say, your curiosity or your drives you into, sort of, say, encountering other disciplines, right? But I think, I honestly believe it's an absolute necessity, right? And I'm just wondering, is there a way that we can kind of foster this better in a, let's say, educational environment? How would you do it?
I cannot answer that, but no, the way that I, in my teaching and the teaching programs that I am involved in, the key to this is to have the student develop this self-awareness, so the ability to position herself. And this is within the program, as a student, as a learning subject. What do I need to learn? What are my weaknesses? What are my strong points? So the self-reflexivity and awareness, but also about what is the point of this program? What is the point of the field that I am in? As a basis for being able to have a fuller positioning of yourself in the world, in future collaborations, because the world is collaborative, whatever the profession is you're going to be ending up in. Our students, I'm in media studies and media art and performance studies. It's very different from a discipline like architecture in many ways. So it's not a self-evident label for students. They have sometimes difficulties to explain to their families, for example, what it is that they are trained in. They sometimes don't know how to articulate or to think about how their program, their nexus of expertise is actually part of the humanities, which is, for my field, an important bracket. But you have a whole different answer because you're involved in designing these interdisciplinary teaching programs. So, yeah. So that's going to be a long answer.
No, it can be a short answer. I mean, I think I also wrote down self-reflexivity. So that, to me, is the most important positioning, and self-reflexivity are the most important elements of successful interdisciplinary collaboration. And also, I think we should introduce, and I think that's what you're saying, we should introduce the future quite early in the education of students. So, and also, so for example, what I do in my own program, which is an interdisciplinary bachelor's program, we ask students to reflect not only on their disciplines. They can choose whatever discipline, 45 different majors all around Utrecht University. So they have to choose one, they have to reflect okay, what does this mean? What can I add in interdisciplinary collaborations? What do I miss? Blah, blah, blah. But then also we have developed some specific roles that the students will eventually have to take. So they will become professionals. What kind of professional skills are we actually teaching the students? They will become, because of university education, they will become specialists. They will become intellectuals. They are citizens already now. How do they want to develop themselves into these roles? So we fold kind of the future in a way into in the course of learning. Also so that we, and through this we also teach them to reflect and to be self-reflexive and self-aware with both information and with functions, jobs, whatever, activism, jobs they already have. Like what are they learning? What are they contributing? What are they lacking?
I could just add that as architects in future we will be more and more doomed to work interdisciplinary. So complex houses, buildings, projects are complex and more complex endeavors. And we will need to be able to work in team, but I see it also as a big opportunity. It's a big opportunity for the architect. Architects need to be confident enough and define their role in these teams. And architects should never stop to be creative, because this is actually one of the key knowledge or skills that we bring into these teams. And I think also digital technologies and so will be a vehicle to make it more and more easy and accessible to work interdisciplinary.
One little thing to, tiny something to add here. Well, it's also these roles also means that, and reflecting upon them also means, for my students at least, like reflecting on, you know, also like skills, like am I the person that is like always taking initiative? Am I somebody that is always slacking, and are deadlines difficult for me? Like the social contract, you know, that you need in all kinds of collaborative projects. That is, I think, also important to kind of immediately introduce for this future collaborative kind of world. And this doesn't mean like all of those stupid tests, you know, that, oh my God, you are an inventor and you are, you know, not that, because that's not well conceptualized enough. Those, I don't even know how to, personality tests, kind of. They will become identity labels, and that's not strong enough. But reflecting upon inclinations, I think, is also important.
Maybe, Milica, you want to conclude, because otherwise I think
we have to conclude.
We have to conclude.
Absolutely.
I mean, just one word. I think that it's really interesting to have this kind of ping pong and let's say conversation among disciplines. In fact, that might not talk to each other. We were also talking about the subdivision within disciplines. I think we also. Trying to bridge that with this format, and also try to have a conversation where we're obviously moving beyond that. And one of the main aspects is, of course, the critical view that one would have on its own discipline, on the boundaries of the discipline, and also in reaction to the kind of algorithmic conditions that we are facing. So I'm quite happy with the setup. I think it's a really maybe a little bit unusual, but at the same time quite fruitful. I would conclude.
Yes, so I also find it, for me, was also a really surprising session, because I mean, for us it was a kind of a brave move to bring you and Benjamin together, but we felt that this might click, and I'm happy that it. I feel that it worked out, because we got quite a rich discussion and quite illuminating on many levels. So I want to really thank you both for Iris, Nana, and Benjamin for this interesting session. And I just wanted to say to kind of bring. I mean, you know, it was about concepts, so we have to finish with concepts, but. I really kind of enjoy this redemption of creativity that you brought in. This is something that is so central to, let's say, architecture in a broad sense, and that perhaps there was a kind of crisis of this term. I'm not sure if it's on your list, but I beg you put it in.
Creativity itself?
Yes.
It's in there.
It's in the glossary. Fantastic. Yes, okay. And I think I also don't know these terms that we speak about now in the end, which relate to the kind of disciplinary questions that I also enjoy very much, self-reflexivity and position, right? And these are a kind of, let's say, disruptive or kind of risky notions in the context of education, you know, in the context of the kind of you know, architecture is often a kind of a Meisterschule, you know, students reproduce positions and so on. So it's not that creativity is just creative, it's also about emulating, it's also about, I just really enjoy this moment of thinking what self-reflexivity and position would mean in the context of architectural education, right? And I think the kind of idea that this would bring us to a much more critical and creative practice, and also interdisciplinary practice, is really something that's really promising. So we'll do our best.
Let's continue the conversation. Let's keep it an open-ended conversation.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very
for
much.
being here, and see you next time in about a month. Thanks very much.